Elizabeth at A Literary Princess. If you are new here, welcome. I'm a 6-year PhD candidate in English literature with a focus on Victorian women novelists, and as you might expect, I love to read. Today I have my first video of the 18th century novel project. In this project, I am reading 12 books from across the 18th century in the year 2025, starting early on and ending in the 1790s. And our first book for January was Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. We are going to start with some history on Defoe and the novel, along with a brief summary, then talk about some major themes, and then my thoughts on it just as a book. Please be aware there will be spoilers for this. Is this a book you can really spoil? I feel like everyone kind of knows what happens in this, but I don't know, maybe not. So there will be spoilers. If you don't want to know what happens, you should leave and watch this after reading the book. So let's jump in. Daniel Defoe led a rather fascinating life. He was born in 1660 and died in 1731, and he started off his life as a merchant. A businessman, very normal. At some point along the way, he becomes a spy, which makes him the second major writer that I know of who was a spy, the other one being Christopher Marlowe. I'm like, weird, but okay, would love to know more about that, but it doesn't sound like very much is known, so that's disappointing. But okay. He eventually spent some time in prison, and then when he got out, he turned to writing to provide for his family, starting as a journalist and a pamphlet writer, and then publishing his first novel in 1719 at the age of 59. So a very late start to his novelist career. And that novel was Robinson Crusoe. This is a story of our title character getting shipwrecked on an uninhabited island and living there for 28 years. That's a very long time. My God, that's a very long time. It is thought that this is somewhat based on the life of Alexander Selkirk, who was a Scotsman who was shipwrecked on an uninhabited island for like 5 years, so Defoe definitely exaggerated a bit for dramatic effect. This book was incredibly popular when it came out, and it continued to be incredibly popular, especially in the Victorian period. But I mean, even today, I feel like we all know who Robinson Crusoe is, even though I don't know if it's as widely read as it used to be. Like, this was my first time reading it. But we all kind of know who he is. This was at one point second in translations to only the Bible. So like that shows how truly popular it was, that it was getting translated into so many languages and being read everywhere. So, we start off with Crusoe as a young man in his early 20s, and he decides that he is going to go off to sea. His father says that's a terrible idea, don't do it, and Crusoe says, I'm gonna do it anyway. And everything in his life goes wrong from there. He is shipwrecked, not once, oh no, twice. 28-year stint, that's the second shipwreck. He got shipwrecked once and decided to go back out on the sea. Why? Why would you do that? Not only that, between the two shipwrecks, a ship he is on is captured and he is sold into slavery. Like, he escapes. It is a whole big thing of him escaping. And eventually he ends up in Brazil, where he has a thriving plantation. And you would think, yeah, he would just stay there. No. No. No, he goes back out, and that's when he is shipwrecked for 28 years. He's not the brightest bulb. At the beginning, anyway. A large portion of the book is taken up with him surviving, building his shelters, taming goats that are living on the island so that he can use them for milk and meat, growing crops, and figuring out how to do all of this and how to live the most comfortable life he can. And he's alone for most of this. For 24 years, in fact, until a group of indigenous people to the area come up on the island with their war captives who they are going to kill and eat. We'll talk about it. We'll talk about it. And one of those captives is a man who becomes Friday. Crusoe helps him escape from the other group, and Friday basically swears to serve Crusoe for his life. And Crusoe sets out to teach him how to speak English, to convert him to Christianity. And, you know, they live on the island for another 4 years before a group of mutineers comes up on shore. And then there's a whole thing of retaking the ship. And eventually, once that's done, they sail back off for, I forget where, and he ends up going back to England and then back to Brazil and lives happily ever after, I guess. So that's a basic summary. Let's talk about some of the major themes that I noticed. So really what this is at its heart is a Bildungsroman. It's a coming of age story. We start with Crusoe being a moron, a young idiot who listens to no one's advice. And his father gives great advice. This is what his father says to him before he sets out. After this, he pressed me earnestly, and in the most affectionate manner, not to play the young man, not to precipitate myself into miseries which nature and the station of life I was born in seemed to have provided against, that I was under no necessity of seeking my bread, that he would do well for me and endeavor to enter me fairly into the station of life which he had been just recommending to me. And that if I was not very easy and happy in the world, it must be my mere fate or fault that must hinder it. And that he should have nothing to answer for, having thus discharged his duty in warning me against measures which he knew would be to my hurt. In a word, that he would do very kind things for me if I would stay and settle at home as he directed, so he would not have so much hand in my misfortunes as to give me any encouragement to go away. And to close all, he told me, I had my elder brother for an example, to whom he had used the same earnest persuasions to keep him from going into the Low Country wars, but could not prevail, his young desires prompting him to run into the army, where he was killed. And though he said he would not cease to pray for me, yet he would venture to say to me that if I did take up this foolish step, God would not bless me, and I would have leisure hereafter to reflect upon having neglected his counsel when there might be none to assist in my recovery. And darn was his father correct. Stupid young guy doesn't listen to the people that are smarter than him and gets himself shipwrecked for 28 years. In the time that he is shipwrecked, he grows up. He has to. He, first of all, finds faith, which he, of course, would have been raised as a Christian because this is 18th century England, and I think this is actually taking place in the 17th century. But he doesn't really, pray or even think about God. He says at one point, I do not remember that I had in all that time one thought that so much as tended either to looking upwards toward God and inwards toward a reflection upon my own ways, but a certain stupidity of soul without desire of good or conscience of evil had entirely overwhelmed me, and I was all that the most hardened, unthinking, wicked creature among our common sailors can be supposed to be, not having the least sense either of the fear of God in danger or of thankfulness to God in deliverances. So just even after spending quite a lot of time on the island, not even thinking about it. Until the point he hits rock bottom. He is incredibly ill and thinks he's going to die. And so he is, sitting there thinking, "Now," said I aloud, "my dear father's words are come to pass. God's justice has overtaken me, and I have none to help or hear me. I rejected the voice of Providence, which had mercifully put me in a posture or station of life wherein I might have been happy and easy, but I would neither see it myself or learn to know the blessing of it from my parents. I left them to mourn over my folly, and now I am left to mourn under the circumstances of it. I refused their help and assistance, who would have lifted me into the world and would have made everything easy to me. And now I have difficulties to struggle with, too great for even nature itself to support, and no assistance, no help, no comfort, no advice. And then I cried out, 'Lord, be my help, for I am in great distress.'" And after this, he starts to feel a lot better. He starts to pray daily and read the Bible that he rescued from the wreck. And he says, "My condition began now to be, though not less miserable as to my way of living, yet much easier to my mind, and my thoughts being directed by a constant reading of the scripture and praying to God to things of a higher nature. I had a great deal of comfort within, which till now I knew nothing of." So once he turns to God, his whole kind of outlook changes, and he is able to move from being this stupid young man that made stupid choices and is just wallowing in his own misery to becoming kind of the master of this island. And that is kind of the next theme I want to talk about, is that of imperialism. So this was obviously written in a time when the British Empire was really getting expanded. And that was a big thing to be focusing on. This book kind of shows a miniaturized version of British colonialism. So instead of seeing, a whole country taking over various parts of the world, we see a man basically taking over this one island. We see him kind of tame the wilderness, building what is essentially a fortress, eventually, cultivating crops that would otherwise not have grown, and becoming master of the animals. He says at one point, "I descended a little on the side of that delicious vale, surveying it with a secret kind of pleasure, though mixed with my other afflicting thoughts, to think that this was all my own, that I was king and lord of all this country, indefeasibly, and had a right of possession, and if I could convey it, I might have it in inheritance, as completely as any lord of a manor in England." And that idea of him being lord of the manor or king of the island kind of keeps coming up. Later on, he also has people to rule over, because he rescues Friday. They also end up rescuing Friday's father, and I believe it's a Spaniard. And he says, "My island was now peopled, and I thought myself very rich in subjects. And it was a merry reflection, which I frequently made, how like a king I looked. First of all, the whole country was my own mere property, so that I had an undoubted right of domain. Secondly, my people were perfectly subjected. I was absolute lord and lawgiver. They all owed their lives to me, and were ready to lay down their lives, if there had been occasion of it for me." So, yes, in addition to becoming lord of the island, master of all the animals, he subjugates the people that he comes across, starting with Friday, who he names. That name is based on the day that it was when he came up on the island, but that's the only name we ever know him as. So Friday he must be. And like English colonizers, he starts teaching his language to Friday. He converts him to his religion and of belittles the culture that Friday comes from. And when I say kind of, I mean quite a lot. So the depiction of the indigenous people is really not great because it was 1719, as you can imagine. And Friday is very much like subjugated. When they first kind of meet after his rescue, he says, "At length he, Friday, came close to me, and then he kneeled down again, kissed the ground, and laid his head upon the ground, and taking me by the foot, set my foot upon his head. This, it seems, was in token of swearing to be my slave forever." So, yeah. And we see this and he even says it at one point. There's like this very paternal feeling, like he's the father and Friday is a young child. And that was a kind of metaphor that was frequently used for slavery at this time and after. So he's teaching him to have good morals and to not eat people and to believe in God and to speak English and all this stuff. So it's very not great. It's kind of uncomfortable. It was 1719. And it gives a really good look at kind of what the viewpoint was at that time. So what did I ultimately think of it as a book? Obviously, there's some very outdated ideas here. However, it's actually kind of fun. Like, it's a fun read. It's a pretty good story. It gets slow at parts. There's this part in the middle that's just his journal from the time, and like, today it rained. Today it rained again. Today I built part of my fortress. Today it rained again. Like, I was like, okay, my guy. There's also a lot of repetition of the same information, I noticed. So this is told in the first person. So he's like writing this down and tells a bunch of the information, and that is then like, I'm going to include my diary. And then the diary gives a lot of the same stuff he's just talked about. The novel was still in its very early days. It was still really being developed. So it's understandable that this would not really look like entirely what we think of as a novel. There's no chapters. There's no breaks at all, unless you count the journal entries. So that's very interesting. It's like, I'm not gonna read it all in one sitting, so it's very hard to know when to stop. You just kind of have to pick a place and hope that it's a decent place to stop. 18th century spelling and grammar conventions are also really kind of odd. So they would capitalize all nouns and italicize proper nouns. The author of this version, who is John Ricchetti, did away with the capitalization of all nouns. I was like, it doesn't add anything, which I completely agree, it does not. But he did keep the italicization of proper nouns. There's also, when there's dialogue, there's no quotation marks like we would usually see. Sometimes the dialogue is italicized, sometimes it's not. It seems like kind of a crapshoot for whether it will be or not. Okay. However, despite this, and like that all makes it kind of harder to read as a modern reader, I still found it pretty readable. And I don't know if that's just because I am now very used to reading older works and have gone through a PhD program. But I remember when I read Roxana, which is one of his later novels, 1724, I think. I read that in undergrad. And it was unreadable. I was like, what is this? No chapter breaks, the dialogue's weird, and that editor kept all the capitalization of the nouns. I was just like, what is this? It was very difficult. This was way easier than Roxana. And again, I don't know if that's because I've changed a lot as a person and a reader, because obviously that was over 10 years ago. Ew. Anyway. Or if it's just because this is a more readable book than Roxana was, which it's definitely a more exciting book than Roxana is. So I did find it ultimately pretty fun. Slow at parts, especially because Friday does not show up until like the very end. I kept reading. I was like past the halfway point. I'm like, where is Friday? Hurry up. Things get very exciting once Friday shows up. There's all kinds of like battles and shootouts and daring escapes. It's great. I ultimately did find Crusoe a kind of endearing character. Like for most of the beginning, I was like, wow, you're dumb. You are an idiot. What are you doing? But as he went through his self-realization and changes, I was like, okay, you're less of an idiot now. So it was like a nice story to see this character change. And Ricchetti in the introduction talks about how this is kind of one of the first English novels to do that. So he says, literary historians have singled out Robinson Crusoe as perhaps the first true instance in English of what we now call the realistic novel. They mean that Defoe's book fairly consistently renders its main character and narrator as a particularized individual situated in very recent history and society in all their moral and ideological complexity. Then later says, Crusoe's narrative in the long run offers what the novel since Defoe's time especially aspires to represent: personal growth, self-realization, development and maturation, as Robinson in his isolation overcomes his moral and physical limitations, finds solace and serenity in religious belief and material self-sufficiency, and becomes master of himself as well as the lord of his island. So this very introspective thing that we're pretty used to in novels now, this is really one of the first instances of it in English literature. So I find that really interesting. I'm ultimately very glad that I read it because this is a very important book in the development of the English novel. I've heard Defoe referred to as like the grandfather of the English novel. Some say this is one of the first great novels. I think Aphra Behn would like a word with the people that say that because she definitely came first, but you know. So yeah, I actually did really like it. I gave it 4 stars. I'd be interested to see some of the film adaptations because I know they're out there. I'm also wondering if Wishbone did an episode, because I feel like this is totally the type of book that Wishbone would have done an episode of. If you don't know, Wishbone is a children's show from the 90s where an adorable dog teaches you all about literature and acts as one of the main characters in a piece of classic literature. It's great. But yeah, so I'd be very interested to see a film adaptation or 2 of this and how they handle it. So that is Robinson Crusoe. Let me know down in the comments below. Have you read this book? What did you think of it? What were some of the things that you noticed? For February, I will be reading Love in Excess by Eliza Haywood, which was also published in 1719. So it will be very interesting to compare the two. They're very different types of novels. And of course, one is written by a man and one is written by a woman. And it'll just be interesting to see what people were doing literally in the same year and how it was different. So that will hopefully be up at the end of February. This is obviously coming up later than it would have, mainly because I refilmed it. Wasn't happy with the first filming, so I am doing it again. This is the second time, so. All right, if you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to see more of my bookish content. It has been great chatting with you. I will see you soon. Bye.